By the time this episode is released, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act may already be signed into law. This is the sweeping budget bill that's been the subject of much criticism and debate from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and President Donald Trump's signature legislative priority. Now, we're recording this on July 2nd, the day after the Senate passed the bill in a 50-50 tie broken by Vice President J.D. Vance. It now goes back to the House for its approval, possibly today, before heading to the president's desk. Now, assuming that the bill passes, what are the big picture impacts for the U.S. economy? What are the major economic provisions of the bill, and what do they mean for jobs, inflation, growth, and not least, the deficit? What are congressional Republicans and the president getting right, and what are they missing? John Diamond is the director of our Center for Tax and Budget Policy and the author of a new paper published last week by the Baker Institute that models the macroeconomic impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. His analysis finds that the bill could modestly boost GDP and investment over time, but that long-term growth potential of the bill is limited. John is joining me today to discuss his analysis and what fiscal impacts we can actually expect. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. John, I know this has been an exhausting time for you and everyone focused on analyzing what exactly is in this act as it changed on the floor of the Senate and now goes to the House. But what's the headline takeaway from your analysis? Or to put it in other terms, what's the significance of this bill? There's a budget bill every year. What's different about this one?
What's different this year is the tax cuts that were passed in 2017. A large portion of those are expiring. That's going to lead to an increase in taxes on the U.S. taxpayer of roughly around $3 to $4 trillion. And that would be a big hit. And that doesn't happen every year. So this year is special. And it's the result of something we've seen over the last 2 decades, which is tax reform passed as a temporary policy. So we passed the 2017 Act. Most of the corporate provisions in the Act were permanent, but on the individual side, most of the provisions were temporary. And those are set to expire at the end of this year. So that's what separates this year from just another year in which, a large tax bill is not expiring. Now, what are the results of an extension of the 2017 Act plus a bunch of new provisions that the administration has added? My research and the numbers that we're putting out today in a paper I've written shows that overall GDP could increase by about 0.3% in the long run from enacting this bill. Consumption would also increase in the long run, upwards of 0.7%, but investment falls. And there's one reason for that. Although this bill would increase it early on, roughly by a percentage point, in the long run, investment would fall. And the reason that occurs is simple crowding out of private capital. When the government takes on too much debt and it borrows debt from the market to finance debt, you crowd out private capital. And that leads to a reduction in investment and a reduction in capital, which ultimately leads to workers being less productive and real wages falling. And that's exactly what my report shows. A huge increase in the debt-to-GDP ratio, roughly from 98% currently to 120% in just 20 years as a result of this reform. That's in addition to CBO's projection that it's already going to increase by about 25 basis points. And such a huge increase in the debt-to-GDP ratio crowds out private capital, leads to less investment in the long run, even though you're passing tax cuts that should encourage new investment. That's more than being offset by the effects of a larger debt and larger deficits. That's the general finding in the paper, and it's the caution. If we're going to pass tax reform, it needs to be done in a fiscally responsible manner.
And John, on the subject of fiscal responsibility, let's talk about briefly the two different ways of analyzing the baseline impact, legal and policy, because that's gotten quite a lot of attention.
Yeah, so you can think about this. There's these discussions of current law versus current policy. Almost always, CBO, JCT, the organizations in Congress that are tasked under the 1974 Budget Act with producing the baseline and giving the information to policymakers about how the policies they're proposing affect the baseline, use what's called current law. And current law is just, whatever the law says, that's what we assume in our baseline. But the Senate bill has used this other measure, which is current policy. And current policy says, well, instead of looking at current law, so current law is that the 2017 tax cuts expire at the end of this year. So current law says next year we will have tax rates equivalent to what they were before TCJA passed. Current policy says since tax rates this year are under the TCJA, let's just assume that those last forever. And so if you score the bill under a current law estimate, you're going to get that it increases debt by about $4 trillion. But if you do it under current policy, basically there's no cost of extending a lot of the provisions. A few of the new provisions would add, and so you would have a small cost. And so there's a giant difference between the revenue estimate you get from using either current law or current policy. Now, which one is right? That's the easiest question to answer. Current law is right. And the bill tells you current law is right, regardless of all the political speak going on in Congress. And how do we know the bill tells us that? Because the last section of the bill raises the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. And if current policy really mattered and there was no deficit effect, then you wouldn't need to raise the debt ceiling. But we do.
All right. And now, John, in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the lead editorial, which is not exactly praising the bill, or if it is, it's faint praise indeed, notes that it does do one important thing, which is it makes clear for investment purposes what tax policy is going to be going forward, and that in and of itself is significant. Do you think, John, that the significance of that step, clarifying what tax policy will be for businesses and investment, offsets the other problems of the bill?
I think it's an important consideration. Is it enough to say that passing the bill as is a wash? That's a harder question to answer. Even the numbers in my paper kind of say, yes, that's true. It's kind of a wash. I definitely think that making the investment incentives permanent, both for capital income as well as for research and development expenses, is critical. And for far too long, we have been extending those policies on an every 2 or 3 year basis. And so I think that's one great part of this reform. Now, are there a lot of provisions that are not great in the bill? Yes, there are. And I would definitely like to see a different bill passed, one that includes the permanent provisions, one that doesn't spend a lot of money through the tax code, one that doesn't carve out all the revenue raising provisions that were enacted under the 2017 Act. For example, the cap on the deduction for state and local income taxes. This isn't the one big beautiful bill. This is the good, the bad, and the ugly bill. And there is good, and there is bad, and there's definitely some ugly.
And John, before we get into some more specific details on impact, talk about that. In your view, what is the goodest part of the bill and what is the ugliest?
Well, the best part of the bill is making permanent the investment incentives and the research and development deduction. I think it's important not to allow taxpayers to be hit with this $4 trillion tax increase. So the extension of the rate cuts. I'm not a big fan of the qualified business deduction, but at the same time, if you don't allow that deduction to be passed, there's the treatment of corporate and non-corporate income becomes really stark, and I don't think that's a good thing. So something like that to be passed temporarily, and then hopefully we can reform that later on, makes some sense. A lot of the 2017 provisions say the large increase in the standard deduction while taking away personal exemptions, eliminating the effect of the AMT by increasing the exemption and expanding the phase out. That took a lot of people off of a really complicated tax form and allowed them to just file a simpler tax form because they don't have to itemize deductions anymore. They just get this one big standard deduction. The AMT is no longer a problem for them. And so all of that is really good stuff that we should keep. So there's a lot of good in the bill. And then there's some bad. And the bad is it doesn't add up. The deficits are way too large. The increases in the deficits are way too large. And that's going to offset a lot of the positives that we would expect from the bill. And I've already talked about this is you know, if you run large deficits, you're going to crowd out private capital. And that just undoes the good that's done by having the permanent investment incentives and the lower rates. And then there's just some really ugly provisions in the bill. And look, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Those are bad provisions, even if they were permanent. They're even worse when they're 4-year provisions that expire, you know, at the end of 2028. Look, you can make an argument for not taxing Social Security benefits, but the way they've done it by increasing the standard deduction for senior citizens is just a gimmick and not good. And there's stuff in the bill deep underneath the bill. I mean, there's also the state and local tax deduction, increasing the cap. That's another just giveaway. That's not a good part of the bill. And then there's really minor stuff in the bill, like the treatment of gambling. So it used to be that if you won 100,000 and you lost 100,000, then your losses offset your winnings and you would face no tax. But this bill limits losses to 90%. So if you win 100,000 and you lose 100,000, you will now be taxed on $10,000 of income. It's really hard to make any sense of that. That's just, I don't know why we're doing something like that. So the bill is just chock full, and we could sit here all day and go through all of the various provisions, but that's a good overview of just some of the craziness. And then I didn't even talk about the clean energy stuff. You know, there's taking back a lot of what was done in terms of clean energy and the Inflation Reduction Act. There's differing views on that. Some people think we need to be expanding clean energy in order to promote cheaper energy for all American consumers. The question is are those provisions effective, and are they really promoting clean energy at a lower cost, or have they been relatively ineffective? Getting rid of them to raise revenue to reduce the deficit effects of the bill is a good thing. But there were some good provisions that we've gotten rid of.
And John, if you had to characterize the bill as it's been done politically as, quote, good, close quote, for seniors, for lower income, for middle class, what's the reality here?
You know, there's no one, you can't just characterize a big bill like this. First of all, let's start with a couple of obvious facts. The bottom half of the income distribution really doesn't pay any taxes. In federal income taxes, they obviously pay the payroll tax. So do we really want to measure the bill based on some version of equity, which we know the answer before we ever calculate it? The top half pays the income taxes, the bottom half doesn't. So if we're cutting income taxes, then it's going to be skewed towards benefiting the top half relative to the lower half. Second, for the lower half to benefit, we have to do exactly what I think we shouldn't do, which is spend a bunch of money through the tax code, start giving people money by having refundable credits and expanding credits such as the child tax credit to a large extent. And while the child tax credit may be important and helpful to low and middle income families, there is a limit to how much we should just keep spending through the tax code. The other point I would make is just because someone doesn't benefit from the bill today doesn't mean they won't benefit in the future. So if I'm a college student getting an education, or I'm a small business owner that's just opened a small business, and I currently don't have a lot of income, so I would be counted in the does not benefit group. 10 years from now, as your income increases, you may become one of the people who does benefit from the bill. In the same way, if I'm currently making a high income, and then I'm soon to retire and my income's going to fall, I would benefit a lot today, but I wouldn't benefit much once I retire and don't have income. So I don't think we can put that into a simple number as we try to do. Is equity important? Yes. Do we need to be a lot more nuanced in how we considering it and determining if this bill is good or bad? I think we do, because I don't think the number's as informative as some people try to make it.
So, John, taking from what you've just said, the issue of the, quote, affordability crisis, close quote, does this bill, in terms of near-term impact, address that issue?
Yes and no. So it really doesn't have anything that's going to make the world a more affordable place. So in that sense, no. But it does keep people from facing a pretty large tax increase. And as I was talking about, so if you look at a middle class family, if we allowed the AMT to return to its 2017 levels, those families would face higher tax rates, and the AMT would be eating away at a lot of their itemized deductions. And so by avoiding this large tax increase, it does make things more affordable. Now, again, that tax increase would largely fall on maybe the top 20 or 30% of taxpayers as opposed to the bottom, although that's not 100% true when you look at things like the increased standard deduction, the increase in the child tax credit, and some of those provisions, which really benefit low and middle income families.
Now, John, you wrote along with former Secretary, not just of State, but Treasury, James Baker in the Wall Street Journal, about the need for entitlement reform. Now, there is much speculation about the impact of this bill, if it passes in something that resembles the Senate-passed version, on the funding burn through for Social Security, 2032 versus 2033. And then there's Medicaid, Medicare. What is the impact of this bill on those three critical entitlement programs?
You know, there is a small impact, and it would move up. There are estimates that it would move up the exhaustion of the Social Security Trust Fund by a year from 2033 to 2032. But overall, I would say the bill, outside of, there are some work requirements and stuff, and they do find about $1 trillion in savings in Medicaid, not by cutting benefits, but just by increasing requirements that they're trying to say that this person really wasn't the person that was meant to get Medicaid because they're able to work, but they're not. And so they tried to cut it in that way, which is different than, say, cutting benefits for everybody. So in one sense, I think it's good. I mean, we should be trying to cut some of these programs down and make them a little more affordable. But obviously, on the other side, just the sheer addition of $4 trillion of total deficit spending over the 10-year period is a really bad thing for all programs, but especially for programs that are already underfunded and are going to be the cause of an already increasing debt to GDP ratio for the next 20 years.
And John, let's talk about that, because if we're looking at not this bill, but the past almost 40 years of federal budgets and the impact on the debt burden that the Treasury carries, the interest payments, and the effect they have on the dollar, the bond market, where do we go? What is the need? This bill doesn't do it. But what would be required here to fundamentally address the issue of the deficit, the Treasury book of loans, and the impact on dollars?
To say it doesn't do it is kind. This bill actually goes in the opposite direction. It will increase deficits and increase debt. Look, this isn't rocket science. To reduce the deficit, we have to increase revenues and reduce spending. Those are your two options. Well, there's a third. You can increase economic growth. To the extent you increase economic growth, you get to reduce spending or raise taxes by less. Those are our objectives. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how much we want to spend and then raise a sufficient amount of taxes to fund that spending. And we should do all of that with a keen eye on maintaining absolutely the maximum amount of economic growth possible. Those three things, and you solve the problem. Now, it's not that easy, especially when you put politics in the middle of it. But eventually, you spoke about the bond market, we will have to do something because the bond market isn't going to allow this kind of fiscal shenanigans to exist forever. Eventually, we're going to have to get our fiscal house in order. And I will say that one of the things concerning me most right now is the same thing that concerned me at the end of the Biden administration, which is a real shift in how we fund our debts and deficits away from a more stable balance of short and long-term bills and bonds towards a very short-term focused refinancing plan. And that introduces a tremendous amount of interest rate risk into our national problem. And that's something we should look to undo as we look to bring the deficit down. We need to get the deficit down to no larger than, say, 2% of GDP in order to stabilize our debt to GDP ratio. So that should be goal one. And goal two should be to make sure that we're funding our rollover of debt in a responsible way.
And we're at what, about 98% of GDP now for debt?
We're right at 100 this year. We're projected to be at basically 156% by 2055. And if this bill passes, I predict it would increase that projection from 156 to about 181% of GDP.
And John, I am old enough to remember as a Foreign Service officer when foreign countries in desperate economic straits ran over 130, 135% debt to GDP. They were in crisis. And you're talking about much higher numbers than that for the United States.
Yeah, we have the benefit of being the world's reserve currency, which does give us an infinite amount of people willing to take on our debt. I mean, we're still the safest place in the world to borrow from. But if we don't change our behavior, that won't always be true. Second, we do see other examples. I mean, Japan is well over 200% debt to GDP ratio. So I don't predict the bottom's going to fall out, that there's going to be some large financial crisis due to this. But that does not mean we should underestimate the economic impact of spending $1 to $2 trillion a year on interest payments. That's money that we could be spending on consumption or investment that would pay real dividends to the American people. And so just like the credit card bill, if you let it run up too big, you end up spending a lot of money on interest, which actually gives you zero benefit. And that's the cost we're already facing. That cost is going to increase. And then it does increase the risk of a large financial crisis. And that is possible, although I'm not going to say that it's guaranteed or even likely. But the risks are much greater now, and they will be much greater after we pass this bill than they have been in the past, unless we do something to get our fiscal house in order.
John, two final questions for you. The equity markets. What's been the impact of the debate over the bill? What happens if it passes? What happens if it continues to be under debate and doesn't pass? Is there a direct linkage between the exuberance in the equity markets and the status of the one big beautiful bill?
There's definitely a linkage somewhere, but I think that linkage is being swamped by other factors. I think the equity market's going to continue to do pretty well, and that has nothing really to do with the bill. I think this bill will be seen as a slight negative. The debt effects are definitely a negative. The investment impacts are a positive. But those are all being swamped by the impact of AI on reducing the bottom line cost of corporations. We see worker productivity and the impact of AI on worker productivity and the firm's costs are really starting to take impact, or they've entered the window in which we're looking forward on the value of stocks. And I think that's driving the whole equity market forward right now.
Final question, John. Look at your crystal ball, just a short distance forward in time. The Social Security Trust Fund, will it be replenished?
Absolutely. Just like I think it was 1983 that Secretary Baker had to deal with this last time. And I think if I remember correctly, they actually passed the deadline and dealt with it about 2 months after the deadline had passed, right before any real effects occurred. I fully expect that we are not going to allow for a 21 to 23% across the board cut in Social Security benefits. I predict we will deal with it shortly after the trust fund is exhausted and not a minute before we absolutely have to. Although I suggest that it would be really smart politically and economically if we could find a way to deal with it as soon as possible, because the sooner you deal with it, the less it costs and the easier it is to accomplish a goal that's good for the American people.
Great. John, thank you so much for your analysis. We remind the listeners that as of this hour on the 2nd, this is very much still in debate in the House and may well need to go back to the Senate for further reconciliation. But I think you've done an excellent job of laying out the critical provisions, the good, the bad, the ugly in this bill, and the strategic as well as short-term impacts. But we will have further discussion on all these issues in the time ahead. Now, John's full analysis on the macroeconomic impacts of the budget bill is available at the link in the show notes. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zemmel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.